Good evening, and thank you for joining us for our program today. My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. Our program this evening will look at the new book, Beyond the Boundaries of Childhood, African American Children in the Antebellum North. This book uses institutional records, school primers, penmanship books, biographical sketches, and unpublished documents to reveal the worlds of Northern Black children. Drawing evidence from the urban centers of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, the work yields a powerful new history of African American childhood before the Civil War. Our guest this evening, Professor Crystal Webster, argues that young African Americans were frequently left outside of the 19th century emerging constructions of both race and childhood. Our speaker this evening, Professor Crystal Webster, is an associate professor of African American history at the University of British Columbia. She is a historian of African American history and researches history of early America with a focus on African American women and children and criminalization and incarceration. Her work has been published in scholarly journals, public history websites, and edited collections. She received her BA in Africana Studies from Oberlin College and her PhD from the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of African American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She previously taught at the University of Texas San Antonio and was a long-term Mellon Dissertation Fellow at the Library Company of Philadelphia. Professor Webster will give a brief overview and then be joined by MHS's own Kanisorn Wongsrichanalai for a conversation, and they will then open the program up for questions from the audience. Dr. Wongsrichanalai is the Director of Research at the Massachusetts Historical Society. He received his PhD from the University of Virginia, and prior to coming to MHS, was an associate professor in the Department of History at the Angelo State University in Texas. Before we begin the program, I'd like to extend a special welcome to anyone who might be attending a virtual MHS program for the first time. If you're not familiar with MHS, we are the oldest historical society in America and have been collecting, preserving, publishing, and sharing our history since 1791. We hold an amazing collection of close to 14 million manuscript pages, including the papers of 3 of the first 6 US presidents. Because of the support of our donors, we can offer programs such as this evening's to the public for free and keep our library open to researchers. We hope you'll return for future events, and if you enjoy our programs, we hope you'll consider supporting our work by becoming a member. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Crystal Webster and Kanisorn Wongsrichanalai.
Hi there, good afternoon or evening to you all. I'm so pleased to be here today to have this conversation with the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Vancouver, British Columbia. And I'm really grateful to be a guest on this land. And I want to acknowledge I'm coming from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I also want to acknowledge how important this is to name as we reckon with difficult histories and products of white supremacy and settler colonialism here in North America at this very moment in light of attacks on history, critical race theory, and Black and Indigenous life. For those who are interested in learning more about the places that you live and work, you can visit native-land.ca. And for those interested in supporting and getting involved in anti-racist activism, I recommend the Black Lives Matter Global Network. So it is such an honor to have this discussion today. I was a fellow at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and my time spent there during the latter stages of writing this book really helped inspire my next research project and help me imagine the world of Black children living in antebellum Boston. Beyond the Boundaries of Childhood is a social history of Black children in the US North from the 1780s to the Civil War. It's situated in the North, mainly in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, because of the very fraught and complicated transitions from slavery to freedom in the region. And this really centers around the experiences and lives of Black children. There were a few different versions of emancipation in the antebellum North, and the most common was gradual emancipation. Pennsylvania was the first to begin processing or begin the process of emancipating its enslaved populations with gradual emancipation laws, which started in the 1780s. These acts freed children born of enslaved parents after they reached a certain age of maturity. And other states like Rhode Island and Connecticut and New York and New Jersey issued similar acts of emancipation based on age once children reached adulthood. Massachusetts was the only state to issue full emancipation and did so also in the 1780s. So this book takes up the phenomenon of Northern emancipation and does so from the perspective of children, as this process really depended upon changing definitions of what a child was and what freedom meant. Black children, for example, were indentured instead of emancipated, and even in places where they were emancipated immediately, their childhoods were seen as outside of how all children should be treated. In this way, they were suspended between slavery and freedom and did not fit within these newly established categories of childhood and adulthood. Black children's experiences in the North, even if they were free, were marred by racial discrimination and exclusion. And this really impacted all areas of life for a Black child of the North. And in my book, I choose to focus on specific themes and areas, including their labor, their play, their institutionalization in different orphanages and reformatories, their schooling, and the activism of their parents. And today I'm going to focus on Black children's experiences in schools. This is a topic that really comes to life when we look at the geographic makeup of urban centers in cities like Boston. So this really is the perfect venue to look and talk about this history. While scholars have touched on the history of Black education, my book is the first to look at all of these areas from a child-centered perspective. And what this means is I was wholly invested in imagining the world from the eyes of children and challenging adult-centered narratives. So for example, I work to resist the impulse to focus on who or what Black children would grow up to be, but instead argue that their childhoods were significant in and of themselves. And their actions, even as children before they grew up, actions that might have been dismissed at the time or even today as immature and childish or irrational, were political and were strategic. So Black children claimed childhood, and in doing so, claiming this space that was increasingly excluded around wealthy, middle class, and white children, they were politically claiming freedom. And this becomes really clear when we look at their negotiations of schools and classrooms, both their physical negotiation, meaning how they moved within the schoolroom, their behavior, how they traveled to and from school, but also figurative negotiation, how they themselves responded to the concept of schooling. So they expressed agency by highlighting or adhering to, and then sometimes deviating from popular forms of learning, including moral, religious lessons, rote memorization, and different methods of learning. And then they also chose to occupy or leave the social and physical space of the schoolroom strategically. Their behavior, their movement, and their student activities were ways in which Black children enacted politicized responses to increasingly racist schooling practices of the antebellum North. Black Northern children then expressed their desires for citizenship and natural rights as children in their own navigation of the schoolroom, even when they sought to avoid it. So first, I want to supply a little bit of context to what these children were up against, and then I'll introduce some of the really remarkable stories of individual Black children's schooling experiences. In the United States, the typically private, individualized school structure evolved in the 19th century with the Common School movement, which advocated for public and universal educational opportunities for children. However, these efforts excluded Black children even after they were emancipated. In 1827, a survey of schools in the Northeast showed that only 3 schools in Boston allowed for the education of Black children out of a population of 2,000, only 2 in Philadelphia out of a population of 15,000, and 2 in New York out of a population also of 15,000. Whites imposed legal and social restrictions on Black education throughout the North and in the South as a specific strategy of white supremacy in order to control Black children's educational advancement. African American children's education and schooling were challenged by anti-literacy laws passed in the wake of slave insurrections as a direct response to Black resistance. These laws reflected enslavers' perceptions that education threatened the racial suppression that the institution of slavery depended upon. The process of schooling and literacy was also economically restrictive. Only Black parents who had the means to either remain at home and privately educate their children, or who did not rely upon their children's labor while they worked at home or as indentured servants, were able to have their children educated. This changed a bit when abolitionists began to open those few schools for Black children that existed in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, beginning in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In Pennsylvania, Quakers led educational activist movements of this initial period in the late 18th century. Schooling was informal, and the first schools were in Quakers' homes. The earliest established schools for African Americans were founded in the 1750s through the 1770s, and then later by the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society in the 1790s. At this moment, in 1798, James Needham, a 15-year-old Black boy, enters the picture and begins learning to read and write at an evening school run by the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. In accordance with educational practices of the period, an essential element of his learning was penmanship. James invested time, effort, and patience on carefully crafting letters in an expensive notebook. He not only learned the detailed work of replicating and mastering elaborate handwriting models, he received and practiced Christian moral lessons. He learned to, for example, avoid bad habits, and that humility is a virtue. Although learning to read and write through repetitive writing exercises was undoubtedly a difficult process, James and other students at the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society School really took ownership and pride in their learning and in their work. For example, James signed his book largely and boldly. James and other African American children and students shared their experiences of learning at the Philadelphia school through these handwriting exercises. The purpose of these phrases was to instill both religious values and also perfection of penmanship and literacy. However, the chosen passages, as well as what the writer omitted, offer glimpses into their thoughts and feelings. Riches have wings, for example, was an abbreviated version of the biblical verse, riches have wings, as an eagle it flieth to the heavens. The original passage may have had little meaning to young James as a warning against greed, but riches have wings might have resonated differently with him, more appropriately, perhaps as a means to escape racial subjugation of life as a Black child in the antebellum North through education. These writing samples were collected not only for the benefit of preserving the work of the students historically, but mainly to serve as a performative role as an example of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society's work in education. Many were presented at the Abolitionist Convention of 1795, and a note accompanying one writing sample simply stated, "Specimen of the writing of the Blacks in one of the schools in Philadelphia." The children's writing illustrates the ways they took pride in educational advancements. And though the phrases were fairly short, each stroke took incredible care and skill, and very few errors were presented. In the context of anti-literacy laws and violence against schooling, writing was a very radical act, and one that paved the way to pursue new vocational opportunities and to literally document freedom. By putting pen to paper, Black children created a physical rendition of their learning. Ownership of a self-authored book would have had a very powerful impact on the expression of their identities as students and learners, and Black children inserted their own sensibilities, sometimes subversively, into the pages. As the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society became more established in the 19th century, it developed its own standalone school for African American children, and this opened in 1813 as the Clarkson School. This school, as well as one at 19th and Spring Garden, together served as schools to educate young children as young as 7. And at the school, there was a teacher named Martha Schofield. Martha kept records of the students' progress, both in terms of their learning and their behavior. A series of undated notes written by the teacher provide a detailed portrait of the lives of the African American child learners. And some of the notes are a little bit more casual and directed towards the members of the Abolitionist Society, and really illustrate the dire situation that she and the students were in. For example, one note she wrote simply, "I need more pens." And in another, she said, quote, "We will soon need more coal, as it is often too cold to be without fire." Some very desperate notes. But the students also revealed to the teacher their experiences at the school and their struggles in learning. And many of her notes concerned the very physical and material obstacles that they encountered. They had trouble attending school, for example, quote, "mostly on account of inclement weather and bad walking." And when you take into account this note on attendance and compare it with the record of their addresses, you get a very full picture of what schooling life was like for these children. Routing and mapping their distance to and from school shows that many students are walking within 15 to 30 minutes to get to school. Eliza Thomas, William Jones, and Isabella Hopkins all lived at 1216 Carlisle Street, which was a far distance from the school. And out of the 36 students, 21 lived with other school children in the same household or neighborhood and presumably walked to school together. For many of these children, some of whom were quite young, poor weather could be a very physical danger and very hazardous to their health during this walk. While many of the children at the school sometimes expressed enthusiasm about going, others indicated reluctance or irritation at having to attend. Their behavior differed between school hours and after school, and she documented that typically at recess and after school, they misbehaved. One boy, for example, Aaron Wells, was suspended from school for behavior that was both poor in school and at home. Many of the students had conflicts not with their fellow classmates or students, but with students from other schools who were white. One day, a student named Taylor was involved in a conflict with a white boy in which Taylor threw a rock at the boy and struck him in the head. The boy was injured and the police were brought to the scene. Their teacher commented, quote, "The white boys ought to be arrested, as they often wait for the children to be out of school and then they attack them." The white students at the nearby school who waited for Black children to finish schooling then targeted them as a way to challenge their educational legitimacy as students. And white children were not the only people who harassed the school children. In one instance, a man assaulted the students, quote, "using the worst kind of language on the pavement." He was outraged at the sound of Black children running up and down the steps leading to the school. In this way, when they exhibited playful behavior or even just announced their presence going to school, they elicited rage. Whites also targeted Black children on their way to and from school. These daily attacks did not always accumulate into large-scale riots, but they were nonetheless physically and psychologically damaging. By attacking Black children, whites created physical obstacles to the already unstable journeys for Black children to and from school. Each of these issues was connected to the ways in which Black children negotiated the schoolroom and the educational sphere. When they refused to go home, had low attendance, or hesitated to make the journey to school, they expressed agency over attempts to limit their schooling. And their stories show us that the schooling picture is much more complicated and dynamic, that Black children did not always want to go to school, but for good reason. Like the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society, as other states' abolitionists groups developed and gained strength, they also opened schools for Black children, including the New York Manumission Society and the Boston abolitionist movement of the 19th century. Boston's schools for African American children also underwent considerable change, and African Americans themselves led efforts to create schools for Black children after petitions failed to convince the legislature themselves to establish them. In 1820, African School Number 1 became the first public school for Black children, and then a second was created in 1822 following high demand. The Abel Smith School officially opened in 1835 and is now attached to the Museum of African American History in the city of Boston. Despite the creation of these public schools for Black children, some schools experienced low enrollment and public critiques from the Black community. And this happened at the Abel Smith School. In 1834, Abner Forbes was appointed master of the school, and he was initially supported by the Black community due to his own history of abolitionist activism. However, eventually Forbes's own personal feelings, as well as his treatment, were called into question as part of activism against the Smith School, which then spurred efforts to desegregate the city schools. In 1844, a young girl at Boston's Smith School was so mistreated that she fled the school. And according to the public report and investigation conducted by Black activists, the girl, whose name was not recorded, was, quote, so used that she ran away from home and attempted to be admitted to the house of refuge, where she apparently stayed for months. Throughout the 1840s, many other Black children like this girl told parents and adults around them of Forbes's disciplinary practices. Children who attended the school provided lurid details of their appalling experiences. James Brown, an 11-year-old student, described the school's disciplinary procedures and how Forbes, quote, whipped him on the soles of his feet. While he was being so abused, Brown apparently cried out, "Oh Lord, have mercy on me," to which Forbes replied, "If the Lord would, I won't." In these reports, the author's condemnations condemned Forbes' choice to whip the boy, and it's clear that these types of disciplinary actions were not used by African-American parents themselves. The result of this investigation was a movement to desegregate Boston schooling. And it's important to point out that this was initiated not only by abuse, but also by the courage of Black children themselves to come forward and share these stories. And these were children like those of the Smith School, but also like Sarah Roberts, who famously initiated the case Roberts versus the City of Boston, which centered on her long and arduous journey to and from school on foot to the closest school that would admit her. And this practice really marked generations of Northern African American children's limited access to schooling. In this way, schools were sites of abuse, but also could be sites of freedom making. And one of the most important things that I learned from the children in my book is that we should not assume adult-centered narratives of childhood and schooling in a typically progressive fashion. Black children were not just symbols in the equal schooling movement. They lived real lives and had material consequences attached to their schoolings. Sometimes they did not want to go to school because they faced very real physical and material obstacles. And their experiences challenge ways that we think about educational activism, adult involvement, as well as assumed binaries between school and work, as these distinctions were false or non-existent or a little more nuanced for Black children. School was not necessarily just a space of intellectual growth and achievement for many Black children, but also one of fear and abuse, and one that they might be forced to leave. African American parents and guardians who chose to keep their children at home rather than allowing them to be exposed to these types of institutions directly challenged school policies and procedures, thus reappropriating Black childhood as a space that could be celebrated and recognized. And in their negotiations of the classroom, Black children themselves seized their futures and redefined their versions of freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Webster, for that lovely introduction to your book. As Professor Webster mentioned, she was a research fellow here at the MHS, and so we are always so thrilled when our research fellows complete their projects and share them with the world, and we're happy that you came back to share this with the MHS as well. So this is such a remarkable and wonderful and well-written and researched book, and I think one of the greatest parts of this is its imaginative power and the hard work that went into trying to visualize the world of African American children in the North. This is not a topic that has been done, and that's because it's difficult to do. So I think my first question for you is, how did you do this? How did you find the voices of African American children in the archives? What were the challenges? And what were some of the great finds?
Sure, absolutely. So I think that my interdisciplinary background and training really provided me with the tools that I needed to go into the archive and to find these voices. In Black Studies, we are always thinking creatively about how to find Black voices in the colonial archive, in racialized archives, and in unexpected ways. And then this just becomes even more complicated and dynamic when we're looking at Black children, right? Because we have the ways in which they're marginalized because they're Black, but then also because they're children. And for me, that took really imagining childhood in a very capacious way and thinking about how children are in all these spaces that we don't necessarily anticipate that they will be in. And one of the best finds for me made it to the cover of my book, which was such a wonderful way, I think, for me to introduce the book and to introduce the topic. And that was the figure of Rachel, a young girl who was indentured, who found her way into the family papers of an elite Quaker family in Philadelphia. And I think that story and that kind of existence in unexpected ways is both a problem or something to think about in terms of how the archive is constructed and preserved and that, but also in terms of how we as adults think about children. It's a great lesson to think about children not being in these discrete categories, not being in these discrete spaces. But those of us who are around children, who have children in our lives, know that they can enter and leave and find their way and leave things in places that we don't expect them to. They're never really seen and not heard, right? So I think that that's a great lesson that I've learned through this book, is that you can't just look in these places that we assign to children, and that even that assigning to children, right, is changes over time, certainly, and that children can find ways to make themselves visible, reveal themselves strategically. And that was one of the projects of the book too, was to think about Black children revealing themselves strategically as a political act, as a way of claiming childhood, and then as a way of claiming freedom through that claiming.
So speaking of things that are left by children, some of the sources you use here are material culture, like toys and games and whatnot. Would you share just a couple of those with the audience?
Sure, absolutely. And that was something that was really important for me to include, because these were objects that children themselves interacted with. That's also why I really wanted to share those handwriting exercises, because those are some of the only objects that I have created by Black children that make their way in the book. I used some other toys that were curated for children that perhaps some Black children interacted with, but actually I make somewhat of a different argument with some of the toys that I look at, which takes seriously Robin Bernstein's concept of descriptive things and racialized play, and thinks about what this racialization of play through toys would mean and its impact on Black children, how it would mean for a Black child to see a toy that clearly has very racist depictions and representations of Black children. But then I also look at some objects that we know Black children interacted with because they're listed in some of the donated items, for example, to schools or to orphanages, books that we know that Black children read, or books that were designed in certain ways that make it clear that they're designed or addressed to child readers. So I consider what it may have been like for those children to read those kinds of books. Some of the books, or one of the books, is the biography of James Jackson, written by Susan Paul. And Susan Paul was the leader of that juvenile choir, of that document that was shown before we started the session. So there are all these connections also between these different individuals who are working with Black children, and then the kind of objects curated for and distributed to Black children. So those are a couple of the ways that I look at that. And then I also look at some books and periodicals designed for children in mind that feature or focus on Black children, like juvenile anti-slavery magazines that, again, are describing Black childhood and looking at the topic of Black childhood at the time, but in some ways marginalizing Black children's voices. So again, thinking about what that would mean for Black children themselves, and really being careful to focus on the perspective of Black children's interactions with these objects and toys and books.
Great, thank you. So I'd like you to elaborate on two of the big themes in your book here by talking about the changing nature or perhaps the conception of the time. For example, the topic of education. Why was education so important, right? It's part of small r republicanism early on in the Republic. It's clearly important for African-American children in the North to get an education, the schools and whatnot. The very racist reactions to them going to school is an indication of an attempt to prevent them from getting this education. During Reconstruction, some of the first goals of free people is to get an education. So could you tell our audience a little bit about the role of education in American society at this time? Why is it so critical?
Sure, absolutely. And so this gets a little bit at some of these tensions that I'm looking at in this book and touched on today, because the main sort of impulse and movement within many sort of strategies of abolition and even white abolitionist movements and Black abolitionists is education. And this becomes a part of racial uplift later and Black respectability. And as I mentioned, as abolitionist societies gain significance and influence throughout the 19th century, they create more schools for Black children, and these schools become a little bit more developed and a little bit more accessible, which becomes a fairly good measure for many of Black progress and movement towards citizenship. But what I'm interested in this book, again, is what that experience would look like and feel like for Black children when we kind of read between the lines of what is presented by adults and presented by abolitionist societies and even presented by the Black press. And what I noticed, or what I traced a lot in my book, were the sort of constant back and forth or tug of war between Black children and what the schooling meant when we're not looking at sort of published, I don't want to say propaganda, but published literature on the topic. And when we look at some of these unpublished notes and records of Black children, they're really showing a very different picture, or a more a fuller picture, right? It doesn't need to be it doesn't need to just be good or bad. It's just a more complete picture. And I think when we look at that more complete picture, we see that while Black children have more access to school in some ways, this creates some more challenges for them. And again, if we're not thinking in terms of schooling and its meaning for Black adults, but really just focusing on that experience in childhood, not just, well, when they grew up, they had this, it really changes what the education or what the history of education looks like. And so sort of the overview of the history is that as these societies become more developed and influential and have and Black children have more access to these schools, there are more tensions between the Black community and Black children who are attending these schools. So there are other examples beyond the one I gave of the Abel Smith School. There's an example in New York where a similar kind of conflict between the Black community and the abolitionist schools, which are largely run by white abolitionists or white teachers, sometimes colonizationists. They develop conflicts. So what then develops are movements either to desegregate public schools, which in Boston's case was successful and certainly an extremely important historical moment, or movements to create self-sustained, independent Black schools. And this is really the question of the time, but also a question that many schools and places are still grappling with today, right? What is the right strategy? And sort of what route do people take in terms of educating Black children? And what I found really interesting in the work that I was looking at was that sometimes in both cases, Black children were really struggling. And I think this is something, again, we could kind of bring towards the present and in really asking ourselves, are we centering the true experience of the students themselves when we're having these discussions, and what are these kind of other motives behind educational movements? What is privileged when we're focusing on certain directions in social and educational reform?
Thank you. While this is taking place, the very nature of childhood, an understanding of childhood, is changing here in the 19th century. So I was wondering if you could speak about this shift in an understanding of what childhood means and who has access to it.
Sure, absolutely. And one of the things that I was really interested in this project was childhood changing over time, right? But also these various intersecting and conflicting definitions of childhood. So where and when people were recognized as children. And what happens for Black children is that they're really excluded from new ideas of childhood in so many different areas, socially, legally, in schools, in institutions, in all these ways that childhood becomes defined. They're excluded, or the opposite can happen too. They're excluded from ideas of adulthood because they're infantilized beyond times when we would mark an adult. They're still considered children once they're adults. So both things are happening at the same time, and we have these contradictions of childhood when we're looking at Black children. So it really changes how we consider and define Black childhood at the time. So an example of this that I think becomes pretty clear are the ways in which Black children are both excluded from the criminal reform movement, but then hyper-criminalized. So not admitted to the earliest juvenile reformatories and sent to adult prisons, but then not seen necessarily as reformable because they're Black. So again, they're facing these dual forces of marginalization and subjugation as children and as African Americans at the same time. So I think that those were some of the conflicts that I was working through. And then again, when Black children are claiming these spaces, that if childhood is increasingly protected, or increasingly at this moment in the 19th century, increasingly seen as innocent and seen as a space that can potentially be one of carefree play, that when Black children are enacting those forms of, or those forces, or those spaces, taking up space in those ways, then they're attempting in many ways to claim that as a strategy towards claiming freedom and citizenship.
And a lot of the book is centered on basically the urban areas in the Northeast, and I suspect that's because that's what the source space represents. But I wonder what happens if you expand this. I mean, what is childhood different in rural areas, in the countryside, for example? There's a group that you talk about in the book, the orphan trains, I believe, and that's an attempt to take white children from urban areas into the rural areas, right? So I was wondering if you could talk about the differences one might find in looking at children's lives in urban spaces and rural spaces, and maybe talk a little bit about this orphan train as well.
Sure. Yes, it's absolutely different in these different spaces. And it's even different within the cities that I'm looking at. I focus on these cities for different elements that I explore in the book, and they have some things in common, but there are also different ways that Black childhood is visible in some spaces and not visible in others. So, for example, one thing I found really interesting in New York was that Black children were indentured, not always to white employers, but that there was an entire industry around indenturing Black children that was seen as a kind of autonomous space, which was the chimney sweep industry. And I found that to be really fascinating. And that was very different than some of the other industries of indenture, particularly in Philadelphia. I didn't see that level of autonomy in any space. And Black children in cities were indentured to rural spaces outside of cities sometimes. This happened in Philadelphia and New York. As part of the process of gradual emancipation, which removed them from their families and their loved ones when that happened. And childhood in general varies, right, between different groups of people across different racial and ethnic groups and across different classes. It certainly varies in the rural settings versus the country or versus the urban settings. And I think that one of the biggest ways that scholars look at this, or I think maybe one of the most clearly communicated ways that scholars look at this, is probably looking at children's play and their access to different spaces for play. And I was very interested in that for Black children too, in urban centers or at schools and orphanages where they created playgrounds out of urban spaces for children, whereas in rural settings, their kind of access to the environment is very different. They have a more, I would say, more natural access to sites of play than they do in urban centers. And if play, in fact, becomes dangerous in many ways in urban areas. And some scholars have argued that even under slavery in the South, that children had forms of access to play, but this in many ways has been problematized by later scholars of slavery and childhood, who say that access was quite limited, even though that they're in a space that potentially could have many areas for exploration, adventure, and play, that they're still under constant surveillance and assault, essentially, under slavery. So I think in that way, even if we're looking at Black children's indenture to rural areas, that they probably would have very limited access to play. And in fact, some of the children that I look at in my study write about or reflect on that in a personal way and say that they didn't really experience much playful exploration, even though they were in rural settings. And very quickly about the orphan trains, this is part of a chapter where I examine orphanages in the North, and orphanages were fascinating because they documented and preserved a lot about Black children. And the first orphanages were in the US North, and there were several that admitted Black children, but these were all segregated orphanages. They were all Black, and most of the orphan train movement actually did not include Black children, as far as I know. There could be, I'm sure other scholars might be interested in taking this up. I'm sure there'd be more to examine about the orphan train and its racial elements. But the records that I found, the secondary literature that I found, illustrated that that the movement really resisted a kind of universal or integrated element to it, and even the places that were taking these children resisted the inclusion of Black children. So it becomes, the orphan movement becomes a space for activists who are interested in Black advancement some abolitionists, and some colonizationists who are the main leaders of the orphan movement in the North for Black children.
Thank you. So let's do one more question from me, then we'll go to questions from the audience here. If you're familiar with sort of the reform movements of the 19th century, the attempts to spread education to minority groups and whatnot, I mean, do you see a similarity in how Native American children are treated at places like the Carlisle School or at Hampton, or even how Southern African American children are treated after Reconstruction, as to the limitations of their potential, this racist view that they are incapable of learning beyond a certain amount, denying them play and whatnot? Is this a common theme that sort of all children of minority groups face in the United States?
Absolutely, I do see those connections, especially for the kind of legacies of practices in the North that then I think are almost perfected in the South following slavery. So the same sorts of ways of extending Black labor, especially through children, happens in the South. This happens through indenture and apprentice, but also through convict leasing, which involves kidnapping of Black children. And this is in the Jim Crow era through the 20th century. So this really is, I think, influenced by what happens in the North at the time that I'm writing about in my book. And then other reform movements certainly are using very similar practices and language and strategy around really how they're allowing for exclusions of protections of childhood for these minority groups. They're using the same arguments of separating from families, of families being incapable of caring for these children. And then what I found in my book that I've seen and certainly see resonances of in Native American residential schools, they use these arguments to prevent parents from being involved in their children's lives, or prevent what we would see as kind of natural signs of affection for children are twisted in ways and defined as what one orphanage describes as a kind of dependence on children, almost a childlike inability to understand that these children need to be in these places. So again, the very things that we almost define as elements of relationships, natural relationships between parents and children, are then seen as ways to define groups of people as inferior. And that to me was so clear in this book, but then also so clear that people were finding ways around that, and that the children themselves were really understanding what was happening, and really fought actively against those kind of restrictive practices and definitions of childhood. And sometimes they faced grave consequences when they did. So if they escaped or ran away from some of these institutions, they also would maybe be sent to another juvenile reformatory or even imprisoned. But they did so nonetheless. And that in those acts, we're showing that for them, for these children and for their parents, that family constitution and family reunification was an important element of expressing citizenship and freedom that really challenged a lot of these racist processes.
Yeah, that was very much the struggle of the 19th century for various groups. All right. Question here from Peter. Could you say or speculate about Abner Forbes's motives and behavior? Was he a classically bad teacher, or was his severe manner seen as necessary or even of benefit for Black students? How could such a person be in charge of any students, let alone Black children?
Yeah, so I think that in the same ways that there are abusive people in charge of institutions and schools today, I think that while he was seen as a potentially good headmaster at the beginning, if we believe the experiences of the children, which I, in the book, argue we do, we should believe that these experiences happen, that he was indeed abusive. So in that way, I don't think that it was for a greater good. And the other area that I think is really important for us to think about for this story of abuse is not only thinking and considering what people said at the time, which is at the time, the children said it was bad and the parents said it was bad, but also kind of thinking again from the child perspective in general, that even if at the time the parents and teachers said, well, this is for the greater good, if only the children were coming forward and saying that this was abuse and that that they needed to get out of this space, that they were fleeing this space, that should be enough for us to really take seriously their claims as historical actors. And that's one of the primary politics behind my book, is that the children themselves have enough agency and voice to really tell us what happened. And they told us that there was this abuse happening and that it was not benefiting them in any way, so much so that they needed to get out. And so I think that that's a really powerful lesson for us to listen to children. And I think it's just so moving that the parents that they did listen to the children. And not only did they listen, but again, it inspired an entire movement around desegregation in the city of Boston. It inspired and mobilized organizing of Black parents and adults, which then has this massive impact. So I think it's a really powerful story and lesson, about listening to children.
Yeah, there are a lot of really inspiring stories in your book. I mean, there are a lot of difficult stories, but there are also these moments of hope as well. Question here from Sarah. Did you find any material about Vermont's experience with Black children's schooling, recognizing that there were few of them relative to larger urban centers? We do lay claim to Alexander Twilight as the first Black college graduate from Middlebury College and a schoolmaster in his own right at Athenian Hall in Brownington, Vermont. But I don't know about Black children in the educational world of early Vermont, even at Twilight School. Did you come across anything?
Thank you for that question. I did not venture outside of the scope of my studies so far. I used some other school examples for context to think about what happened to the children in my study, like Prudence Crandall's school. And then I looked a little bit more at children in some other settings, mainly outside of the cities, but still in Pennsylvania and New York and Massachusetts, but not as far as Vermont. So that's very interesting information. I'm sure it's certainly relevant information. And I know that there are a number of scholars who are working on more projects expanding the history of schooling of Black children, including, you might look out for them, Mike Jurek and Cabria Baumgartner, who are both really, I think, expanding how we think about the history of education in Black children in this period. But thank you for that question.
And who will both be speaking at the MHS in the fall. So we hope you'll tune in for that. I'm going to turn this back over to Gavin.
I just wanted to thank you both for a wonderful conversation, and thank you, Professor Webster, for a wonderful work of history and digging into some unused resources and archives. It's a great work of scholarship. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, and just let them know that we certainly encourage you to purchase a copy of the book if you would like. And as always, we encourage you to support a locally owned bookstore, or use bookshop.org, which supports other locally owned bookstores. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening.